Preston threw 4 typed pages onto my kitchen table and smirked. He looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "An old grunt who spent 30 years chasing brainless heroics in burning buildings is not the right influence for our children, Cal." Right there, at my own dinner table in Corsicana. I'm Cal, retired HFD, and that exact second changed everything. I said just one word, "Okay," and quietly dialed a number I had secretly prepared 2 weeks ago. Preston had absolutely zero idea what he had just set in motion. 2 weeks later, a sudden call from my grandson's school counselor blew the whole thing wide open. "Hey everyone, if you love raw, true stories about dads and grandpas protecting their families no matter what, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. You're going to want to see exactly how far I went to expose my son-in-law and take back my family. My name is Cal Briggs. I am 63 years old. I live on 2 acres outside of Corsicana, Texas, which is a city of about 23,000 people that most residents of Dallas have heard of but never visited, which suits Corsicana just fine. I spent 30 years with Houston Fire Department, the last 12 as a battalion chief. I want to say something about what that work does to you, because it is relevant to everything I am about to tell you. When you fight fires for long enough, something changes about the order in which you process information. You stop reacting first and thinking second. You start doing both at the same time, with the reaction going underground while the thinking stays on the surface. People who do not know you well see the calm and assume you are not bothered. What they are actually seeing is a man who learned, the hard way, that panic kills faster than smoke. You also become a particular kind of reader of rooms. You walk into a structure, and before you make any decisions, you find the exits. Not yours, all of them. You identify the load-bearing walls. You figure out what is holding the structure up before you decide what can be safely removed. You learn that the walls that look the most solid are sometimes the ones already eaten through, and the ones that look ordinary, unremarkable, structural, those are the ones you protect. I carried all of that with me when I retired. I carry it still. It is not a burden. It is a way of seeing. My wife Margaret died 4 years ago. A stroke. Wednesday morning, June 9th. She had made coffee, which I found still warm in the pot, and she had taken it to the back porch where she always drank it while looking at the yard she had been slowly and deliberately turning into something beautiful for 31 years. Butterfly garden along the south fence. Raised beds for tomatoes that I had built her the summer of 2002 and rebuilt 3 times since. A small concrete bench she had painted yellow because she said the yard needed one thing that was unambiguous. She was gone before I knew to be worried. The coffee was still warm. The bench was still yellow. The tomatoes she had planted that spring came up in August, and I picked every one of them and put them in a bowl on the counter and did not eat any of them for 4 days. That is not a thing I have told many people. I'm not going to spend more time on Margaret's death than that, because this story is not about her death. It is, in some ways, about what she left. Not money or property, just the weight of knowing what a family is supposed to feel like. She had very strong feelings about that, and 31 years of living inside those feelings means that by now those feelings are mine too. My daughter Tessa is 38 years old. She is an ER nurse, which is the kind of person who walks toward the problem rather than away from it. And she has always been that way. She got her directness from me and her warmth from her mother. And in the best versions of herself, those 2 things work together. And she is extraordinary. I have watched her work in an emergency situation once, at a family gathering when her nephew fell off a deck and hit his head. And I want you to understand she was better in that moment than I was. And I spent 30 years in emergencies. Tessa has 2 children. Owen is 14. Mae is 10. Owen has been my person since the day he was born. That sounds like a thing grandparents say about all their grandchildren, but I mean it specifically. When Owen was 2 years old, he used to follow me around the property while I did maintenance. I would look down, and there he would be, about 18 inches behind me, watching what I was doing with his full attention, the way small children do not usually watch things. He did not talk much at that age. He just watched. When he was 4, he helped me replace a rotted post in the south fence, and when we were finished, he put his hands on his hips and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has fixed, and he nodded, once, and went back inside. He was 4 years old. I thought about that nod for about a week. Owen became interested in weather patterns when he was around 10. He set up a rain gauge in the backyard at Tessa's house, a proper one, a Davis Instruments, that he saved his birthday money for, and he started logging the readings every morning at 7:14. I do not know why 7:14. That was just when he did it. He texted me the readings every day, just the number, and a brief note. 0.3 inches overnight. Cold front holding, barometric pressure dropping. It was the most consistent communication I have ever received from another human being, and I mean that without any irony. Every morning at 7:14 for 2 years. I knew exactly what the weather was doing in Dallas, and I knew that Owen had gotten up and gone outside and measured it. Mae is something else entirely. Mae arrived in this world with opinions already formed, and has been refining them with great energy ever since. She asks questions in sets of 3, always 3, never 2, never 4, and she requires all 3 answered before she will move forward. She has hidden candy and couch cushions at my house for at least 5 years, and denies it with the complete sincerity of someone who has convinced herself it is not technically a lie if she means it when she says it. She once asked me, in a single sitting, why fence posts rot faster at the base, what kind of wood resists rot longest, and whether I had ever built a fence entirely from scratch. I answered all 3. She thought about the answers for a while, and then asked 3 more. On the wall in my back hallway, I have measured Owen's and Mae's heights since Owen was 2 years old. Every mark is dated in permanent marker. Next to each mark, I wrote something in my small handwriting, sometimes just their age, and a word or two, sometimes more. Owen, for the year he decided caterpillars were his friends. Mae, 3 stood on her toes, smart kid. Owen, 7 found him singing to himself on the hiking trail. Owen, 10, stood next to me at Margaret's grave and put his hand in mine. Mae, 8 hid something in the tool chest. Still haven't found it. The most recent mark for Owen was from 8 months before the Saturday Preston came to my kitchen table with his folder. The gap was visible on the wall, a stretch of blank paint where a boy was becoming whoever he was going to be, and I was not there to mark it. Tessa met Preston at a hospital fundraiser 2.5 years before the Saturday with the folder. She called me to say she had met someone. I asked the questions a father asks. She said he was a pediatric surgeon. I said that sounded like someone doing good work in the world. I meant it. A pediatric surgeon has made a decision to spend his professional life on children's emergencies. I gave him every benefit of the doubt I had. The first time I met him was at a Sunday dinner at Tessa's place. He arrived with good wine, and he was polite in the way that very confident people are polite. It costs them nothing, so they do it freely. He shook my hand and held the eye contact about 1 second longer than necessary. I have been shaking hands professionally for 40 years. That extra second is a tell. It is not a dangerous one. It is an assessing one. He was deciding what I was within the first 60 seconds, and he thought I could not see him doing it. I did not say anything about that. Over the months that followed, I watched how he was with Owen and Mae. He was never cruel to them. He was never loud. He was simply not interested in them, in the specific and detailed way that children need to be interested in order to feel truly seen. He asked Owen about school, the grades, the classes, the general categories of school. He did not ask Owen about the rain gauge, or the weather patterns, or the Davis Instruments setup, or the morning readings, or what the barometric pressure had been doing over the past week. These were the central facts of Owen's daily interior life. and they did not exist for Preston. He got Mae birthday presents that were age-appropriate in the way that a search result is age-appropriate. He had looked up what a 9-year-old girl was supposed to want, and he bought those things. They were never wrong exactly. They were just never right. I noticed. I said nothing. I was a guest in those dinners, and my role was to be pleasant, which I was. Tessa and Preston married about a year after they met. I walked her down the aisle because that is what she wanted, and because I wanted it too. At the reception, I shook Preston's hand and said, "You take care of my girl." And he said, "Always." It was what you say. It sounded like what you mean. The first concrete thing I noticed was about 8 months after the wedding. Owen called me on a Thursday night and said, "Hey, Grandpa, are we still on for Saturday?" I said yes. He said, "Mom said to remind you that pickup is at 10 now instead of 9 because of Preston's schedule." Preston's schedule. Not Owen's schedule. Not Tessa's schedule. Preston's schedule, which had now become the clock that organized when I could see my grandchildren. I said, 10 it is. I wrote it down, but I had filed that word schedule the way I filed everything. There was a family therapy meeting in August, about 6 weeks before the Saturday with the folder. Preston had recommended a therapist for the family, a woman named Dr. Linda Farr, in a suburb of Dallas, whose office had the specific, well-ordered quality of a professional who understood that the room itself was part of the reassurance she was selling. Tessa called me and said that Preston felt it might be beneficial for the whole family to have a session. I said I would be there. I sat across from Dr. Farr in a chair that was designed to be comfortable enough that you stopped noticing you were sitting in it. She had a legal pad. She was warm and professionally attentive in the way that therapists are, which is a different thing from the warmth of someone who actually knows you. Preston was present. Tessa was present. The children were not. Dr. Farr asked me to describe my relationship with the grandchildren. I did. I was direct and specific. I told her about the height wall and the fishing trips and the camping lake and Owen's rain gauge. I told her about Mae's questions in sets of 3. I was specific because I had learned 30 years ago that in any situation where someone is assessing you, the most powerful thing you can present is specificity. Generalities can be reframed. Specific facts are much harder to argue with. She took notes. She nodded in the way therapists nod, to indicate they are receiving information, without yet forming a judgment. Then she said, "How do you think the children experience the contrast between your home environment and the environment at their primary residence?" I said, "I don't think in terms of contrast. I think in terms of what they need when they're with me." She said, "That's a helpful distinction." Then I asked her a question. I said, "How many sessions have you had with Owen?" She paused. She said that her sessions were with Tessa and Preston at this point. I said, "So the observations you are forming about Owen's developmental needs are based on information from one household." She said that was a fair point, and that she had recommended including Owen in sessions. I said, "Has Owen been included yet?" She wrote something on her legal pad. I thanked her for her time. I shook her hand. I drove back to Corsicana. That was the last time I spoke with Dr. Farr. But I had seen what I needed to see. The folder Preston would bring to my kitchen table 6 weeks later had its origin in those sessions. In a room where he and Tessa were the only two people providing the information that was shaping what was being written down. The assessment was being built from one side of the room. That is a structural problem I have seen in burning buildings. It is the same problem here. The walls look solid until you understand only one set of supports is holding them. The fishing trip was in September, about 5 weeks before the folder. We were at the lake by 7 in the morning. Owen had his portable rain gauge. He had started bringing one on outdoor trips because he wanted comparative data from different locations, which was so completely Owen that I had stopped being surprised by it. Mae had candy somewhere in the tackle box, which I had known since before we left the house. It was a good morning, cool and still. The lake was flat, and there was a blue heron working the far bank with the particular patience of something that has been doing this long enough to trust the process. About an hour in, Mae was braiding the fraying end of the spare fishing rope, the way she sometimes braided her own hair when she was thinking. She looked at the water and said, without looking up, "Preston says Grandpa's house is a liability." The heron lifted off the far bank. Owen said, "Mae," in the voice of someone who had been told not to say something and was now watching that thing being said. Mae looked at her brother. "What?" "He did say it." I did not say anything for a moment. I watched the heron settle back down about 30 yards further along the bank. "A liability," I said. "Like a danger risk," Mae explained helpfully. "Because of the tools, and the ladder, and the garage stuff." He said old houses are liability risks for children, and that some of the storage in the garage doesn't meet code. I said, Mae watched me. "Are you mad?" "No," I said. "I'm fishing." I checked the line. Rebaited. Set it back in the water. I thought about the word liability. I thought about the folder that word had come out of. I thought about the person whose voice it was in, and about what that person was doing with that word in conversations I was not part of, with children who were not yet old enough to cross-examine the vocabulary being used to describe the place where they had measured their heights on a wall since they were 2 years old. Owen caught a catfish 30 minutes later. He was careful with it, he always was. He held it properly in the water, let it breathe, kept his hands still until it was ready, and released it without drama. He looked at me after, and I nodded. I drove them home at 3. When I pulled into the driveway of Tessa's house, Preston was on the front porch with his coffee. He watched the kids go past him into the house. Then he looked at me. He raised his mug. Perfectly civil. I raised a hand back. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for about 15 minutes before going inside. Then I called Hank Morrison. Hank Morrison and I have known each other for 35 years. He was a firefighter in Houston for 15 years before a knee gave out on him, and he went back to school and became a family law attorney in Dallas. He has the face of a man people underestimate in courtrooms, and he has used that underestimation to good effect several hundred times. He also drinks his coffee cold because he forgets he is holding it when he starts thinking, and he starts thinking continuously, so his coffee is always cold. I have given him a hard time about this for 35 years. I told him the situation without editorial. The marriage. The way the scheduling had changed. Preston's clinical vocabulary being applied to my relationship with my grandchildren. The word liability. Hank listened without interrupting, which Hank always does, and then he said, "Do you want me to look into him?" I said, "I want to know if there is anything I should know." He said, "That is a yes." I said, "That is a yes." Hank had a contact at the Texas Medical Board. He had another one inside the hospital system Preston was affiliated with. He said he would make some calls and get back to me. We talked for another 20 minutes about a game we had both watched. Then I ate the dinner I had left warming on the stove and went to bed. What Hank found, he told me 2 days before Preston arrived with the folder. There was a formal complaint filed against Preston at his current hospital. A conduct matter involving a junior colleague. An issue of professional behavior in the operating room environment over an extended period. Nothing proven. The hospital had opened a formal review process. In the same week that review was opened, Preston had applied for a position at Boston Children's Hospital. The timeline between complaint and application was 11 days. I sat with that information for 2 days. I did not call Tessa. I did not call Preston. I did not speak to Dr. Farr. I did not do anything with it, except think about it. I was a firefighter for 30 years. I know the difference between a flame and a load-bearing wall. I know which one you address immediately, and which one you study first and protect. What I had was information, not yet a weapon. and I was not certain I was entitled to use it even when it became relevant. What I knew for certain was that I needed to understand fully what I was dealing with before I decided anything. Then came the Saturday with the folder, and I said okay, and they drove back to Dallas, and I fixed the gutter, and I opened the yellow legal pad. I want to explain what I was doing with that journal before I tell you what came next, because if you do not understand what I was building, the ending will not make sense. A firefighter over 30 years learns that the worst consequences of a structural failure are not always the fire. Sometimes the worst consequence is the record or the absence of one. You learn to document because you learn that the version of events written down first is the version that persists. And the version written with professional vocabulary and a folder and a section titled Proposed Structure will outlast a grandfather's general impression of his own relationship with his grandchildren. Preston had been writing a version of events for 8 months. He had been writing it in conversations with Tessa, in conversations with Dr. Farr, in the quiet editorial work of adjusting what the children heard about me and what words they heard used to describe the things I did. He had been building a file in the language of developmental psychology, which is a real language with genuine uses, and which I do not have the credentials to challenge on its own terms. I could not answer his folder with my own folder. That was not a fight I could win. What I could do was write something in the language I did speak, the language of specific, verifiable, witnessed memory, the language of 31 years of being a father and 4 years of being a grandfather, the language of knowing things about Owen that cannot be known by someone who was not present, reliably, through the specific, unscripted moments that make a particular human being who they are. So I wrote. I wrote about the day Owen was born. I wrote about holding him in the delivery room while Tessa slept and Margaret was getting coffee, and about going out to the parking lot at 2 in the morning and sitting on the hood of my truck and telling Margaret, who had come back and was asleep in the car, that her grandchild had her eyes. She woke up enough to hear me, and she smiled without opening her eyes. I drove us home at sunrise. I wrote about the summer Owen was 7 and got turned around on a hiking trail. He was not in danger, the trail was short and the weather was good, but he had been gone long enough that the specific silence had gone from normal to wrong. I had learned in 30 years to trust that distinction. I found him about 20 minutes later by following a sound I had not expected. He was singing, quietly, to himself, a song I did not recognize. When I came around the bend in the trail and saw him sitting on a rock in a patch of afternoon light, singing to make himself less afraid, I stopped walking, and I stood there, and I listened for a full half-minute before he saw me. I wrote about that because I do not want that image to exist only in my memory. I want Owen to know that his grandfather stood in the woods and listened to him and thought, there he is. I wrote about the week after Margaret died. Owen was 10. He came to the house 3 days after the funeral and sat in the kitchen, and after a while, he said, I don't know what to say, Grandpa. I said, then don't say anything. We watched a baseball game on the small television, and neither of us watched it, and that was the whole afternoon, and it was enough. I wrote about Owen's rain gauge. About the morning readings, he texted me every day at 7:14 for 2 years without being asked. About the one morning the text didn't come, when he had strep throat and Tessa had his phone, and about how I had been 15 minutes from getting in the truck and driving to Dallas before she called to say he was fine. I wrote about Mae and the candy, about the specific brand of peanut butter cups she hid in my couch cushions, and how at some point, without making a decision about it, I had started buying an extra bag and slipping them into the cushions myself so she would always find one, and how she had never asked where they came from and I had never told her, and how that small private arrangement between us was exactly the kind of thing that does not appear in any folder under any section heading. I wrote about the height wall in the hallway. I described every mark, every note. I wrote, Owen, this wall belongs to you. These marks are not decorations. They are the record of every time you stood still long enough for me to know where you were. I wrote about what Margaret said when Owen was born. I wrote about what she said when Mae was born. I wrote about the specific yellow bench in the backyard that she painted because she said the yard needed one thing that was unambiguous, and how Owen had sat on that bench every time he visited for the last 4 years, always in the same spot at the far right end, and how I had not moved that bench and did not intend to. I wrote about being a firefighter. I wrote about why I chose that work and what it cost, and what it gave back, and what I learned from it that I could not have learned anywhere else. I wrote about what it means to walk toward the thing everyone else is walking away from, and about how that is not a pathology, it is a decision, and about the men and women I worked beside who made that decision every shift for decades, and about what I saw in them that I hoped I had found some way to pass along. I wrote 43 pages over 2 weeks. My handwriting is not elegant, but it is consistent. I have the handwriting of a man who fills out reports. The last entry I wrote the night before I went to Tessa's house. It said, "Owen, I know something is wrong right now, and I know you can't call it by its name yet. I know you're being given words that don't feel like yours and asked to use them. I know what it feels like to stand in a room where someone else is deciding what the air means. I have walked into rooms like that. Here is what I learned. You look for the load-bearing wall. You find what is actually holding the structure up. You protect that. You do not let anyone convince you that the thing holding everything level is the problem. I'm not going anywhere. I will be at the fence. You know where." 3 weeks after the Saturday with the folder, Mae showed up at my house on her bicycle. She was not supposed to be there. The new arrangement meant no solo visits. She had not called ahead. Tessa did not know she was coming. She knocked at 3:47 on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in her school clothes still, backpack on, slightly out of breath from the hill at the bottom of the county road. She said, "Hi, Grandpa," with exactly the same energy she would have used if she had been expected. I said, "How did you get here?" She said, "I took the route I know." I said, "Does your mother know you're here?" She said she was going to text her when she arrived. I said, "Text her now." She did. Then, I made 2 mugs of hot chocolate, the cheap powdered kind she preferred over the expensive kind, which she described as tasting like a decision, a phrase I had never fully decoded, but which I found accurate. She sat on the back porch steps and took her backpack off and looked at the yard for a moment. Then she said, "Can I help with the fence thing? The fence post on the northeast corner of the property has been rotting out at the base since I moved here 12 years ago. The soil in that corner drains slow. I replace the post every few years. It rots again. It is the most persistent small problem on the property, and I have come to regard it with something that is not affection, but is in the same general neighborhood." I said, "You can hold the post while I tamp." We went out to the corner and worked on it. Mae asked her 3 questions. Why does it rot at the base and not the top? What kind of wood lasts longer? Did you ever build a whole fence from scratch? I answered all 3. She thought about the answers, then 3 more questions. This continued for most of an hour. After a while, she said, "Things at home are different now." I said, "How do you mean?" She thought about it the careful way she thought about things. She said, "Preston is always explaining. Like everything has an explanation. Why something is happening a certain way. Why something is being done. There is always a word for it." She paused. Owen says it's like living inside a TED Talk. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that Owen had put that very precisely. She said, "That's Trenny. The tinner on time anymore. He eats in his room. Mom says he is going through something. Preston says it is a phase." She was still holding the post. She looked at it. "Owen does not seem like he thinks it is a phase." I said, "What does Owen seem like?" She thought about that with real care. She said, "He seems like he is waiting for something, but he doesn't know what he's waiting for." Like when you know it's going to rain, but the sky hasn't done anything yet. Owen's vocabulary, in that image. The weather vocabulary. I said, "That's a good description," she said. "Mom cried in the shower on Tuesday." She thinks we can't hear the shower, but we can hear the shower. I tamped the post. Set it level. Checked it twice. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. She nodded once, in the way she had, and then said, "Are there any peanut butter cups in the couch cushions?" I said, "I honestly don't know." She went inside to investigate. I stood at the fence corner for a while longer. The sky over the east end of the property had gone the particular color that means rain in the next 3 hours. Owen would know that from his readings. He would have known it since this morning. I went back inside and called the school counselor's number that I had looked up when the Tuesday-Thursday pickups changed and saved in my phone against the day I might need it. The call from Owen's school came the next Thursday, not from me, but to me. Miss Flores, the school counselor, introduced herself and said she was calling with Owen's knowledge and consent, which I noted and appreciated. She said Owen had experienced panic attacks too in the past 3 weeks. The first in biology class, the second in the hallway before lunch. Both times he had gone to her office. Both times he had come down in about 20 minutes. She said she had asked Owen who he talked to when he felt overwhelmed. He had given her 3 names: his mother, me, and his rain gauge. She said she was listing those in order as he had given them. She said, "Is there anything you have noticed recently that might be contributing to elevated stress?" I said, "I have some thoughts on that. Can I call you back this afternoon?" She said yes. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table. I looked at the yellow legal pad on the counter, 43 pages of it now, handwriting across every page. I thought about Mae's description. He seems like he is waiting for something but doesn't know what he's waiting for, like when you know it's going to rain but the sky hasn't done anything yet. I thought about the hospital complaint, about the 11 days between complaint and application, about the professional vocabulary being assembled in Dr. Farr's office from one side of the information. I thought about what that vocabulary was doing to Owen from the inside, the explanations for everything, the word for every feeling, the structure around every relationship that was supposed to be spontaneous and therefore structureless. I thought about a 14-year-old boy measuring his own anxiety in the same rain gauge language he used for the weather. I got in my truck. I did not call ahead. Preston answered the door. He was in his weekend clothes, the careful casual of someone who considers the impression he makes in all situations, including Saturday afternoons at home. He looked at me and processed something for a fraction of a second. And then the professional smile arrived, smooth and precisely calibrated. He said, "Cal, this is unexpected." I said, "Is Tessa here?" He said she was upstairs and that this was not the best time, that they had plans that evening, that he hoped I understood, and more slowly, with the particular care of someone choosing each word, that it might be better for everyone involved to schedule visits in advance, as had been discussed. I said, "I know. I need to see my daughter." There was a moment. It was brief, but something shifted in that moment from the managed version of our relationship to the real version, and we both felt it. And he stepped back and let me in. Tessa came downstairs. When she heard my voice, she came down the way you come down, when it is your father, and something in your body knows it before your mind catches up. She looked tired in the specific way that people look tired when they have been using energy to maintain something that takes more energy than they have. She looked at me. She said, "Dad." I said, "Hi, Tessa." I sat down at the kitchen table. Preston was still in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. He had his arms crossed in a way that was probably not conscious and was absolutely communicative. I put the yellow legal pad on the table. I said, "I need you to read something." Preston said, "Cal, whatever this is, I think the appropriate channel would be to—" "Tessa," I said, "please." She sat down. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at my face. She picked it up. She started reading. Preston said, "Tessa, I think we should probably—" She held up one hand without looking away from the page. He stopped. She read for a long time. She turned pages. She did not rush. I sat across from her, and I watched her face, and I did not look at Preston. Preston moved to the counter and stood there. I could feel him trying to find the appropriate intervention and failing to identify one that did not make things worse. When Tessa reached the pages about the week after Margaret died, about Owen at 10 years old sitting in my kitchen saying he did not know what to say and me saying then don't, and the baseball game we had not watched, she stopped. She set the pad down on the table. She pressed both hands flat against the tabletop for a moment. Then she picked the pad back up and kept reading. She read all 43 pages. It took close to 30 minutes. I sat across the table, and I waited, and I did not speak, and I did not look at Preston. When she finished, she set the pad down carefully, the way you set something down when you want to acknowledge its weight. She was quiet. Her face was doing several things at once that I was not going to comment on. Preston said, "This is exactly the kind of engagement pattern we have been trying to address with Dr. Farr. The emotional dependence this represents on both sides is—" I looked at him. I said, "From where you sit." He stopped. I said, "From where you sit." That's a phrase I'd like you to think about for a moment. Because from where you sit, the information you have about Owen's emotional life is what has been provided to you in an office by a therapist who at the time of my single meeting with her had not yet met Owen once. From where you sit, he looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating. I looked at Tessa. I said, "Tessa, when you were 15 years old and your mother had her surgery, I sat in that hospital for 72 hours. I did not leave, except to go home and shower. I called your school every morning at 6:15 so you would not have to. I did not tell you I was doing it. I just did it because it was the thing that needed doing and I could do it. If Owen is having panic attacks in school, and listing my name as his safe person to the counselor who asked him, that is not a child who is enmeshed in an unhealthy pattern. That is a 14-year-old boy telling you something in the only language a 14-year-old boy has. The same language he uses for everything important. Specific, measurable, precise. Like a rain gauge reading. Tessa's eyes did something. I stood up. I left the yellow legal pad on the kitchen table. I said, "That is for Owen. When he is ready for it." I looked at Preston one more time. I said, "I know what you have, Preston." I did not say more than that. I did not say complaint, or review, or Boston, or timeline. Just, "I know what you have." He was very still. I said goodnight to Tessa. I walked out the front door. I did not slam it. I drove home on the highway in the dark, and I listened to a game on the radio the way I had been doing my entire adult life, and I did not know what was going to happen next, which was uncomfortable but clean. When you do what you can do and then you leave, the uncertainty is at least honest. I sat on my porch for a while. The stars were out. Corsicana gives back stars that Houston spent 30 years taking. I looked at them. I went in. I added a final line to the contact sheet I had prepared for Miss Flores. I sent it in the morning. Tessa called on the 4th day. I was at the northeast fence corner again, tamping a different section that had been showing the same slow rot. The ground drains wrong in that corner, and it always will. The phone buzzed in my shirt pocket and I pulled it out and it said Tessa. I answered. She said, "Can we come over?" I said, "I've got the grill going." There was a silence on her end that resolved itself into the sound of her crying, quietly, in the way she cried when she did not want to be heard doing it. I waited. She did not need me to say anything into that silence. She just needed me not to fill it with something wrong. She said, Okay, we'll be there around 4. I said, I'll make sure there are hot dogs. She laughed. It was a watery laugh and a real one. I hung up and went in and started the grill. They came at 4:15. The 3 of them. No Preston. She did not explain and I did not ask. Owen was quiet through dinner. He ate 2 hot dogs and drank 2 glasses of sweet tea and looked at his phone twice, checking something I did not ask about. Mae had found the candy I had put in the couch cushions that morning and was in excellent spirits. Tessa and I talked about things that were not what we were thinking about, which is sometimes the right conversation to have the repair of the ordinary things after the extraordinary ones. After dinner, when Mae was inside and Tessa was washing up, Owen came and sat on the porch step next to me. We were quiet for a while. That was always Owen's way. He needed the silence to get to the thing. I had known that since he was 2 years old, following me around the property, not saying anything, just watching. He looked at the yard. He looked at the south fence line. He said, "The fence on the northeast corner looks better." I said, "One section of it." He nodded. Then he reached over and put his hand on my forearm. Just for a second. A brief, specific wait. He took his hand away. He did not say anything. I nodded. He nodded back. We sat out there until full dark, and the stars came in, and then he went inside. And that was the whole of that conversation, and it was everything. I will tell you what happened with Preston because this story should have its full shape, and not just the shape that is comfortable. 6 weeks after the evening I went to their house, the hospital conduct review became a matter of public record. A junior colleague, a resident, had formally escalated a complaint about a sustained pattern of workplace behavior. Preston resigned from his position before the formal review concluded. 2 weeks after his resignation, Tessa filed for divorce. She stayed at her sister's house in Fort Worth for 3 weeks with the kids while the practical things were arranged. I did not tell Tessa what I had known from Hank's research. I have thought about whether that was right. I think it was. She needed to find her own feet, in her own time. The information I had was context. The story was hers. The decision was hers. What I had given her was the yellow legal pad, which was in the language she could actually use. The rest of it, the complaint, the timeline, the 11 days would have been a weapon I was handing her, and she was not the kind of person who needed someone to hand her a weapon. She needed someone to stand at the fence. Preston moved to Boston in February. He did not contest the divorce in any meaningful way. He did not maintain contact with Owen or Mae. This was the thing I had not anticipated. I had expected him to fight. Because fighters in those situations generally fight. He did not. That told me more about who he was than anything else in this account. Hank called me when it was all resolved and said, "You sat on what I found." I said, "I sat on it." He said, "You never used it." I said, "I didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That took a particular kind of discipline." I said, 30 years of fire. You learn not everything is yours to put out. Sometimes, the structure takes care of itself if you protect the right wall. He said that was going in his closing argument someday, and I told him I would send him a bill. I want to say something directly to whoever is watching this, because this channel exists for a reason, and the reason is not that fathers are always right. I am not a perfect father. I was absent in the operational sense for a good part of Tessa's childhood, not because I did not love her, but because the job was the job. There are things I did not say to Margaret when she was alive that I should have said. I know what each of them is. There are ways I am better to be around now at 63 than I was at 42, and I am not proud of all the reasons why. This story is not a simple one about good and evil. Preston had language I did not have and credentials I did not have, and some of what he said about enmeshment and age-appropriate relationships was not invented. Those are real concepts with real applications. In different hands, applied honestly, That language helps families. I am not dismissing the vocabulary. I am describing what happens when that vocabulary is picked up and used not to describe what is actually happening, but to preemptively frame the narrative, to build a case before the evidence is gathered, to position a document on a kitchen table with sections titled Concerns and Proposed Structure, when the real structure had been built on a back hallway wall in permanent marker over 14 years of Saturday mornings. The thing I want to leave you with is this. When someone uses professional language to describe your relationship with the people you love, the answer is not to get louder or to get angrier or to find a bigger folder. The answer is to go back to the original source. The specific, unambiguous, witnessed facts of what you actually did. Not what you meant to do. Not your general feeling of having been present. The specific. I was at that fishing trip. I was in that hospital for 72 hours. I heard him singing in the woods. I put the extra peanut butter cups in the couch cushions. I wrote down every height on that wall, and I put a note next to every single one. That is the only language that cannot be reframed. Specificity is the load-bearing wall. It is what you protect. I do not know if what I did was perfect. I know it was honest, and I know it was specific, and I know that the 43 handwritten pages on a yellow legal pad sitting on my daughter's kitchen table communicated something that 4 typed pages in a folder could not. Answer: because one of them was built out of documentation, and the other was built out of memory. And there is a difference between those two things that shows up most clearly when a 14-year-old boy is sitting in a school counselor's office, naming the people who make him feel safe. Owen went back to texting me the rain gauge readings in December. The first one came at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. It said, 0.2 inches overnight. Cold front stalled over the panhandle. I looked at that text for about a full minute. I wrote back, thanks. I'll check the northeast corner. That section drains slow. He sent a thumbs up. The height wall in the back hallway has a new mark now. Owen, 14 years, 11 months. Next to it I wrote, in my small handwriting, the kind that has been on that wall for 12 years. The year he came back to the fence. Mae's bicycle is leaning against the porch railing most weekends. She found a peanut butter cup in my work glove last month, which was a new location I had not anticipated. And she looked at me with a very specific expression, and I looked back at her with the expression of a man who has no idea what she is talking about, and she ate it without saying anything more. Which is how we have always handled that arrangement, and will continue to. Margaret's photograph is on the mantle. I talk to it less than I used to, which I think means something in me has settled, which I think she would be glad to hear. The gutter on the back of the house is holding. The northeast fence post will rot out again. It always does. That corner drains wrong, and it will drain wrong until something changes about the soil or the rain or the grade of the land, none of which I have authority over. I will replace the post. It will rot. I will replace it again. That is not a failure. That is what maintenance is. You show up at the corner that keeps failing, and you put the post back in, and you check the level, and you come back when it needs doing again. There is a difference between a house that is maintained and a house that is lived in. I live here. My grandchildren know where here is, and then they know the route, and they know they can show up, and there will be something on the grill. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and subscribe to Dad's True Emotions. Leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. Has someone ever used clinical or professional language to reframe who you are to people you love? Tell me what you did. Tell me how you handled it. Every comment gets read. Know that wherever you are in the right place. Thank you for being here.